With us for our second hour from Maritime Launch Services, Mr. Stephen Matier, President and Chief Executive Officer, and from North Star Earth and Space, Stuart Bain, also CEO and co-founder. So I'll just ask you for your opening 5-minute statements, and around 4 minutes I'll start waving my finger at you. I don't wish to interrupt you, but I may have to. So with that, I'll ask for Mr. Matier, for your opening 5 minutes, please, sir.
Thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity to be here, Mr. Chair, and honorable members of the Standing Committee on National Defense. My name is Stephen Matier. I'm the founder, president, and CEO of Maritime Launch. We're headquartered in Halifax, Nova Scotia. I'm honored to be here today to address the House of Commons Committee on National Defense regarding the current state of Canadian space defense capabilities and programs, including the impact of advancements in space on Canada's sovereignty and national security. The perspective and focus that I will bring to this discussion is related to the crucial need to have assured access to space for Canada through the development of domestic launch capability and its significance to Canada's national defense. If I may take just a moment or two to give you a brief on my background, what brings me here. I have 35 years of experience in the space launch industry. My career has been dedicated to advancing space exploration and ensuring mission safety. I had the privilege of leading teams at the NASA White Sands Test Facility, where I worked on the Space Shuttle program and was awarded the esteemed Astronaut's Silver Snoopy Award, if you want to know what that is, and the Spaceflight Awareness Award for continued commitment to safety in human spaceflight. Following my tenure at NASA, I transitioned into the consulting, focusing on spaceport development in U.S. and internationally, supporting the regulating, development, and operation of numerous sites, including at Spaceport America, Space Florida, and others. Drawing on my expertise, I was commissioned by a renowned launch company to explore potential locations for spaceport operations in North America, where most of the globe's satellites are manufactured. Through extensive research and analysis, it became evident that Nova Scotia, specifically near the town of Canso, offered unparalleled advantages for Canada's first commercial spaceport, Spaceport Nova Scotia. Our geographic location, positioning in Nova Scotia provides an optimal launch site for our clients to place their satellites into the desired orbits by launching south and or east over the Atlantic Ocean. This range of trajectories are highly desirable to these clients and not easily replicated anywhere else in North America. Spaceport Nova Scotia can replace satellites exactly where satellite operators need them to be for global broadband connections, near-Earth imaging, security services, etc. Economically, in total, we expect the construction alone to contribute $171 million to Canada's GDP and boost employment by an average of 1,600 annual full-time jobs across Canada, with 748 of those within the province of Nova Scotia. Once operational, fully ramped up, we will add around $300 million to Canada's GDP annually, boost revenue to governments by more than $100 million, and create close to 1,000 annual full-time jobs across Canada. Developing Canadian launch capability is an economic opportunity we can't afford to miss. But there is another key factor that raises the importance even more, in my reason for being here today. That is the importance of domestic launch capability to Canada's national defense strategy. Canada depends on the performance of its own technologies in space and air in our everyday life. We rely on satellite technologies for communications, surveillance, reconnaissance, navigation, farming, greenhouse gas, weather monitoring, etc. But we've always relied on other countries for launch. Given the turbulent world we live in with threats and opportunities in space, there's a clear imperative for domestic launch infrastructure. Coupling this with the rapid growth of the commercial space sector, as well as the saturation of existing launch capabilities in other countries, specifically the United States, the necessity for our own launch capability has become a vital piece of transportation infrastructure. Whether the launch sites we have used internationally over the decades are overloaded or disabled for any extended period of time, we would not have any means to deploy our technologies. Our global partners are looking for us to be there for them as well. Our location in North America is unique. Orbital space launch is the missing piece. In January of 2023, Maritime Launch was extremely pleased to attend the Government of Canada's announcement to enable commercial launch at the Canadian Space Agency. This announcement committed to modernizing Canada's launch regulations. We also learned that recently the Government of Canada is finalizing negotiations on a technology safeguard agreement, key with the United States. This agreement is critical to the advancement of launch capability in Canada, as its approval will allow for access to mature U.S. launch technology and, importantly, U.S. satellites to be able to launch from Canadian soil. Not only does this bring direct foreign investment into the Maritimes, but it provides for the controls to be able to support the joint interests of secured access to space for our joint North American defense. Economic opportunity is the first, national security is the second, and alliance of strengthening is the third major reason.
Apologize for having to rush you. Mr. Bain, 5 minutes, please.
Bonjour, Monsieur le Président, et Mesdames et Messieurs les membres du...
Good day, members of the Standing Committee on National Defense. It is my honor and pleasure to appear before you today to support your work on the state of Canadian defense capabilities. I'm here today as founder and CEO of North Star Ciel et Terre. Born and raised in Montreal, I'm an engineer whose career in space began in the late 1980s here in Ottawa, working on the RadarSat mission for Cal Corporation, which became MDA and Honeywell here in Ottawa. Since then, my career has taken me around the world on numerous occasions to get involved in innovative business opportunities and develop new and innovative technologies and products. Headquartered in Montreal, North Star is a Canadian-controlled company that has raised over $140 million, the majority of which came from Telesystem Space, an alliance between Telesystem in Montreal and Rogers in Toronto. North Star has significant business interests in the USA, Europe, Japan, and soon in New Zealand. But it is a company with Canadian values.
Estimated to be $550 billion in 2023. And according to the U.S. Space Foundation, this economy will be worth nearly $2 trillion by 2035, U.S. dollars, of which 80% qualifies as commercial activity. With this, I encourage the Canadian government to embrace the challenge presented and mentioned earlier by the witness, Mr. Gallant, in a report by Deloitte of maintaining its 2% economic role in the global economy within the rapidly growing space economy to achieve $40 billion by 2040, 40 by 40. This is achievable and critically necessary to provide Canadians the security and economic benefits expected from and in Canada's role in the global space economy. Broad and positive trends created in and from space are increasingly at risk, both from natural and man-made space debris, but also from increasingly nefarious actions in space. La mission de North Star est fondée sur la réponse à la situation.
North Star's mission is based on answering the following question. How can we effectively and accurately monitor 300 trillion cubic kilometers of near-Earth space precisely in a useful time frame? To achieve this, North Star's versatile team creates products that go far beyond data collection. North Star relies on worldwide developments in the area of data fusion, artificial intelligence, modelization, and advanced simulation to transform and use data in real time.
Surveillance is accomplished mainly through government and commercial ground-based systems, which are inherently limited by atmospherics and geography. On January the 31st of this year, North Star launched the first ever constellation of space situational awareness satellites to actively survey all near-Earth orbits from space. With a plan to achieve 12 satellites as soon as by the end of 2025, North Star is years ahead of any competing system in the world. In this context, North Star serves as an active sentinel, an early warning system capable for military and civil safety, giving all operators more timely, reliable, and accurate information to assess risks, protect, or maneuver valuable assets in a safe manner. Recently, North Star was one of only 2 companies from a pool of almost 60 Americans to receive a contract from the U.S. National Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, DARPA, for their first ever Space Watch program. Northstar is active in the U.S., Europe, and Japan on many other commercial initiatives. Commercial enterprise needs a strong signal from its domestic government about the utility of its capability. Northstar's recent successes create a great opportunity for the Canadian government to leverage private capital and invoke the unique aspects of commercial business that the government must track to gain maximum leverage of innovative commercial space capabilities. En conclusion, Monsieur le Président, je vous remercie de m'avoir.
In closing, Mr. Chairman, thank you for the opportunity to testify today. Northstar welcomes all efforts to enhance Canada's future space, including Canada's space defense interests, both at a national and level and through partnerships abroad. I invite you to ask your questions at this point. Thank you.
To you, we do have a 6-minute round, but I don't think we're going to do 6. We'll go to 5, and then hopefully the second round we can get closer to what we should be on the second round. So 5 minutes, Ms. Gallant.
Yes, my questions are for Northstar. Were an adversary to detonate a nuclear device in low Earth orbit and knock out a satellite, how is your company equipped to track the damage from the space debris generated in the aftermath?
We've already actually done that. We participated internationally with the SAC-T, Sprint Advanced Concept Training, since 2019. Organized by the Department of Commerce and the Department of Defense. Northstar has been an active member on a volunteer basis to demonstrate our capabilities. In November of 2021, there was an ASAT, anti-satellite test, done by the Russians. They took out one of their own satellites, and the world turned to Northstar to track that debris. So we've already had experience doing that, and we would continue to use that skill in such a circumstance.
Okay, and how prepared is Canada to deal with a nuclear detonation in space? And are you in regular contact with D&D, CAF, or the federal government?
How well we are prepared is dependent on how much we are monitoring the activity in space. My experience and my knowledge of that is more towards my interactions with the U.S., so if you'll permit me, I would say that we don't have a wide field of view system. So to go a little bit technical, the way I describe Northstar, we are a wide field of view system. We see all the Earth's orbits from LEO to MEO, medium Earth orbit, where the GPS satellites are, to geostationary, to cislunar simultaneously. This capacity does not exist. So we are not actually well prepared to track all activities in space generally amongst the allies. Northstar does maintain a relationship with the Department of National Defense here in Canada, and we're looking forward to expanding on that now that our satellites are launched and our services are available.
What is the lag time between a space occurrence and the detection of any related space debris created?
The debris is created, if I understood the question, the debris is created instantaneously upon impact.
And how long does it take Northstar to detect that?
You would detect it immediately if you had a sensor in place. Worst case lag time for us would be a matter of hours, but typically we can see something within minutes.
And what's the minimum size of detection of debris?
That we can see? 1 centimeter in low Earth orbit, 7 centimeters in medium Earth orbit, and 40 centimeters in geostationary.
Given that Chairman Xi is overturning the world's rules-based order, how likely is it that any treaties with respect to space debris would be adhered to?
I'll try not to wax political, but I wouldn't rely on a treaty to protect my assets in space.
Does China have capabilities similar to those of Northstar Earth and Space?
If they don't, they will have them soon.
What is the reaction time to the occurrence of a space debris and detection versus the time that it takes a space asset to be aware of it?
Yeah, you're speaking of data latency. So the whole idea, and it's a great question, is with 4 satellites, we just launched 4, we actually need a critical mass of 12 satellites to be able to detect with a sufficient latency that's fitting within the specifications of minutes. You're talking minutes or seconds. So you need more satellites monitoring more often, and then picking up objects multiple times during their orbital pass to get low covariance, which is the error associated with where objects are in space. It's a digression of a question, but the exact location of objects in space is a mathematical calculation. So
Okay.
it takes a while to figure that out.
All right, one for our other witness. I understand that some low Earth orbit satellites can be launched from a C-17 now. They're going towards large aircraft for launch. Will this impact the necessity or any of the business that you have lined up with respect to your company?
It doesn't, in that the market is so large, as Stuart pointed to, the size of the market now with the tens of thousands of satellites that people are intending to put into low Earth orbit to provide services to the world. We're not looking to take any sort of large work share associated with that. And then there's the entire aspect of the logistics and cost associated with a C-17 or some other transport doing it.
Are there any plans to launch military purpose satellites from your spaceport in Nova Scotia in the near future, or will it only launch strictly commercial satellites into space?
We have certainly interest from D&D in what we are doing here for sure, and have interest also from the United States Space Force in what we're doing.
Thank you.
Ms. Lapointe, bienvenue au comité.
You and your company has talked about meeting the challenges of the new space economy. Could you describe for us what you see those challenges as being?
Challenges of participating in the new space economy. It's moving very quickly, so traditional procurement techniques and the ability to transform research and development into monetized commercial activity is the biggest challenge. And when we talk about acceleration of activities in space, we talk about the ability to monetize early and quickly and then to grow. So Northstar, as a private enterprise, raised $140 million not just to develop technology, but also to build and launch 4 satellites. If you do that on a grassroots bootstrap method, you end up being fairly slow at how you get there. So it really is accelerated by the adoption of those products, and having a strong signal and having those products adopted by your domestic government is very helpful in doing work internationally. Barring that, you have to be pretty aggressive to get into other procurement cycles. This year, the procurement cycle in the United States has been fairly hampered by their budget issues, but it all really just comes down to how quickly do we get from the identification of a demand from the government and the procurement plan. So the procurement plan is the weakest link.
In your opening statements, you talked about the sector needing to see some strong signals needed to be seen. Some strong signals needed
Yes.
to be seen by government. So tell us, what do those strong signals look like? What would they be and constitute?
In a word, a contract.
Can you expand?
Buy
on
our
it?
services. I mean, we traditionally, I don't think I'm telling any secrets, the OECD has written reports for decades about how Canada does extremely well at developing R&D and then watching that go somewhere else. We are at the precipice of that point as Northstar, as many other commercial entities are in Canada. There was a question on the previous panel asking, how do we retain talent? Make sure there's a business here. People stay for economic reasons. It's really down to very fundamental. They sound like complicated issues, but they're very simple. When there's good jobs to be had and there's good missions that are going on, we have no hard time attracting talent in Northstar. Unfortunately, most of it goes to Luxembourg, where we have our European head office, and in the United States. Attracting people in Canada is a little bit more challenging because it's not as commercially open in that context. It's meant as a constructive criticism, by the way.
The previous witnesses talked about how Canada is falling behind and we're at risk of a declining relevance in this sector. So what challenges do you foresee for Canada specifically in expanding its role in the space defense sector, and how do you propose we overcome those?
Thank you for the question. It's not a secret either that Canada is by far, and I underline by far, the lowest contributor to space of all G7 nations. That's a huge impact to anybody that wants to start a company here, attract talent here, or build innovative technologies here. And I think that needs to be addressed at a policy level and at a strategic level. The good news is the voice in the wilderness, myself screaming for a few years now, has managed to convince Space Canada, not only of which I'm a board member, to lobby the Canadian government to have a national space council. The chairman of the board of North Star's U.S. entity is Kevin O'Connell, former director of the Office of Space Commerce under the previous administration. He helped set up or reset up the National Space Council, and we brought him here several times to witness and testify to several people about the importance of having a National Space Council. But setting that up properly is also very important. I want to emphasize, given the opportunity here, that it cannot be run by a specific government department. It must be run by the whole of government. It must come from the Prime Minister's office. That's the way it works in the United States, and that's the way it needs to work here. So I'm very happy that we have a National Space Council, but if we bring it down to the departmental level, we don't get a whole of government coverage. And we must have that. We don't have time to waste on iterating and seeing if we can make it better. Space is moving too quickly. The actions are being too menacing. And everyone is feeling it. I feel it in the questions that people are asking. You're quite aware of the challenges that we're facing. So I would say we need a National Space Council that has national recognition from the Prime Minister's office.
5 minutes, Madame Normandine.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur.
Thank you, Mr. Bain. I'd like to continue in the same vein. You mentioned it without actually mentioning you're someone who have contracts all over the world, and perhaps there's an issue in Canada. Is there a reason why Canada has not signed with you, or are there a host of factors, like the fact that Canada is poorly connected with its industrial base, tends to invest very little or elsewhere for some buy off the shelf? Is there something that I'm missing here, something that might not have been mentioned? Someone says that without strategy, everything seems like a good idea. That's in the military space. There seems to be a lack of strategy in Canada. I work with the Canadian Space Agency, and I have for the last 30 years. The last time we had a long-term space policy was 25 years ago. This is, the frustration exists on both sides. The government is just as frustrated as the private enterprises are, because they don't have a policy that says, okay, this is our policy, this is our priority, and this is where we're going to be investing. It's kind of ad hoc, and that means it's just unclear how to decide. It's not completely unclear or vague, but it is not something really clear to tracks in a strategic sense. I think we need to address this, and again, the way to deal with this is to have a National Space Council. It's to develop a strategy, to have the tools in place. And if the government, from a commercial standpoint, decides that the priority is not what North Star sells or will sell, fine. We'll make our decisions strategically on that basis. But when it's unclear, then it's just unclear. Thank you very much. In the meantime, because I think you answered a question by Madame Gallant about the fact that it's very quick to detect debris when there's a collision. Where do you send this information? It's to your clients, and I would imagine Canada is in the dark when it comes to what happens in the space domain. I'd like to point out that Canada is very actively engaged, along with Americans, in those sites in the U.S. and with their allied support among our Five Eyes countries and within NATO. So Canada is involved in that field and has an important role to play. But domestically, we're not in a position where we sell data directly to Canada. All right. So what I understand is, based on the technology you've developed, this is much more specific detection, much more targeted. Is that something that's missing in Canada? Yes. As you said, just as you said. Thank you. One question for you, Mr. Vader. You mentioned the fact that the fact that there's no launching site here in Canada, we have to go elsewhere to find those sites. And there's a saturation of the market at this point. How does it work? Who has the priority to have access to these sites? Is it domestically, so the government decides that the government that owns this, or a company owns this, or how does it work exactly?
Well, there are two major points to that. One is the location matters a great deal. The Space Coast of Florida, where you can put them into a particular trajectory into orbit where you need them, or Vandenberg, for example, on the West Coast. Finding those locations is difficult. So location really matters in those satellites and where they're going to go in orbit, so to be useful. But the second part, of course, is all the other ones internationally, especially in the United States, are government ranges. Government ranges have priority. They will kick everybody else out. SpaceX, et cetera, most of what they're doing is launching other people's government missions along the way, and then, in their case, flying their own satellites along the way. So the bottleneck is space. Building satellites on the ground, there's only one way to get them into orbit, and that's launching them. And because they're launching twice, 3 times a week out of Florida, and they can't keep up that tempo, and all these new launch companies are coming online and new satellites are coming online, how are we going to get them all up there to provide service? And that's where I think that opportunity is.
Okay, 30 seconds again. Madame Masson, 5 minutes.
Mr. Matier, to sort of build up of that, so the fact that Canada doesn't have a satellite launch capacity to date has been a significant issue. I know that in the research that you've done, in the building that you've done, there have also been a lot of environmental and safety concerns from the area, from the residents around there. Can you talk about what your company is doing to ensure that we're within, I guess, regulations, or maybe there aren't enough regulations, maybe not for the company, but certainly for the people, and just the conversation around that?
There is a nationally recognized regulatory framework associated with spaceports in particular, and I came out of doing that in the United States, working on a number of spaceports that I've actually licensed, including environmental assessments and how you can care for the territory. It's not just the land around it, it's the space, it's the water and everything that goes along with it. So working to deliver on that environmental assessment and getting that approved in 2019 was a really big piece for us. And it was really modeled after the work that I've been doing in the United States on a number of similar locations.
Is there still work that needs to be done to further that in order to help industry, but also to ensure that the safety of residents?
It's the execution side now. It's what, we've got the permission. They've looked at every sort of worst case scenario for a launcher that can carry 5 tons to low Earth orbit. So we sort of worst cased it, even using propellants that we're trying to move away from as a global industry. Nonetheless, we did get that qualified for that and found that we can do it safely, and had both federal and provincial participation in that.
In terms of what we've learned from the States, you yourself talked about SpaceX and the domination of that in the private sector. Mm-hmm. What should we be worried about here in Canada on that end, government versus and the regulations versus that lack or that monopoly over the launch industry? We're behind in the other Five Eyes countries, for sure. We started ahead, and the UK has leaped ahead of us. They've got a technology safeguard agreement. They've got the regulatory framework, and they've been making investment in the infrastructure for spaceport development, even though they're on the wrong side of the pond if you're launching a satellite. So we really have a huge advantage by being where we are and the timing of it matching what the industry has in place right now. Transport Canada is working to model after the U.S. Part 450 regulations. That's great. That's the world I come out of. Part 420, those kinds of licensing regimes are really I'm comfortable with, and I think I can help bring and deliver there. The agreement through the Minister of Transport is that we'll use existing CARs to be able to do a case-by-case launch while we're maturing the rest of that regulatory framework over the years ahead. Mr. Bain, in the discussions around that nuclear detonation tests, I believe that you were talking about running, or what you saw through the American tests that you had seen, that was only on other satellites and equipment up in space, correct?
Yeah, let me just go back on the
Sorry,
details.
yeah, if you could clarify that a little bit.
Yeah, so the question was on a nuclear explosion in space, and how would we detect that? I said the same way we would have used during a SAC-T, Sprint Advanced Concept Training drill that we were part of in 2021 when the Russians performed an anti-satellite test, so ASAT, but they did it with a conventional weapon on their own satellite. They destroyed their own satellite. So several countries have done this. Northstar and many other countries and companies around the world have signed anti-satellite treaties. And so it was the experience that we had was gained on doing it with a domestic rocket, domestic weapon, a traditional weapon on their own domestic satellite.
And so there's no known understanding then of what a non-traditional weapon.
Well, if you're going to use a nuclear weapon, it would be much more expansive in terms of the damage, and it would, like anywhere else, first of all, nuclear explosion in space is absolutely unacceptable at any level. Same as an ASAT test. I'm an environmentalist. You don't want to put any explosions or explosives up in space because the debris stays for decades, and it goes up and it goes out because you're shooting from the ground, and it tends to go up further, and the further it goes up, the longer it takes to come down based on gravity. So it's not acceptable. There are various orbits in space that are prime real estate. SpaceX occupies the most prime real estate. That's a chain. They call it the Starlink orbit. It's very heavily populated, and causing a chain reaction in that orbit would be devastating to communications.
Thank you, Ms. Manson. Mr. Kelly, 5 minutes.
Thank you.
Sorry, not 5 minutes. Hang on.
Yeah,
I think we can. I think we could do 5. Okay.
So on the same vein then, how much existing debris currently inhibits potential low Earth orbits?
There's 130 million pieces of debris flying around in space uncontrolled. Each of them is posing a threat to operating satellites. Our system is designed, I'll come back to the question, but our system is designed to help people navigate around that debris. To put it in different terms, it's like the 401 would have every car that's ever had an accident on the 401 still there, and you'd have to drive around it. That's the way space is operating right now.
Right, and you know the obviously exponentially larger space for potential satellite orbits is a factor, and I'm asking are there prime pathways or prime orbits that are threatened by this debris? Like, are there areas where an operator would say, I can't launch this satellite because of the debris hazard? It's already happened. Okay, already happened.
Our launch was delayed. Other launches get delayed because there's a debris cloud that's flying overhead. We never used to deal with that before. And I'm talking not so long ago.
Okay, what are the sources of debris? What creates debris?
Man-made things that have expired in space, collisions in space, which are not as many, but it's leftover pieces of equipment all the way back to Apollo.
Okay, and we've talked about now in Ms. Matheson's question, she talked about about weapons in space and about the potential, the catastrophe. We've had testimony about a nuclear explosion in space, but we've crossed over a lot of unthinkable events in fairly recent years. So I think we have to no longer accept that something is unthinkable. The war in Ukraine would have thought to be unthinkable, but it happened. So let's not be restrained by what we think is unthinkable. How best can Canadian policymakers deal with the threat? Is there a way to secure or to mitigate the risk of unthinkable events of the weaponization of space?
I like the way you're thinking. The answer is you can't move fast enough. Objects in space move at 16 kilometers a second. You don't have time to react. You have to predict in advance. So when I talked about, on the French part of my presentation, when I talked about what Northstar does, we do what nothing else in the world can do. We'll look at space, and then we'll use artificial intelligence and algorithms to predict where objects are going to be in 48, 96, or more hours, giving people enough time to move out of the way. So this capability needs to be embraced generally. I'm obviously biased by saying by Northstar's capability, but you can't go buy it anywhere else. Canada is actually a world leader in this technology and this capability. And so that is the type of system that must be adopted. And my meetings with the Pentagon, again, we're non-classified. So I can have as many discussions as I like about what the general problem is. I'm trying to monitor 300 trillion cubic kilometers of space.
We heard in the previous panel, though, industry being limited by the lack of getting classified briefs. In other words, industry doesn't know what the threats, what the threat analysis of the government actually is because it's classified. Do you lack, or do you see a loss of business opportunity for lack of the correct information from policymakers about their actual defense needs?
I was in the Pentagon 2 weeks ago. I have no lack of information to know what my system needs to do to be able to deliver.
What about from the Canadian government, though?
I don't have those types of meetings with the Canadian government.
Would they be commercially beneficial?
To me, they would.
But they're not happening. Yeah, what about, I think you do understand that this is not to be a platform, I guess, to sell the business, but for any defense contractor to be able to supply the Canadian military the services that it needs, do they get the information they need to be able to tailor products or create products?
You're asking a really deep question, because I will not speak on behalf of the DND. They have a policy and a procedure that they have to follow when they set their priorities. So my stock answer on that question is, where's the National Space Council? Where's the National Space Policy? Where are the priorities that we can follow and identify so that we can move forward? Because without that, we're floating in space.
That is, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Kelly. That's almost as bad a joke as I do. Madame Lalonde, 5 minutes, please.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président. Thanks to both of you for being here. When you think about civil satellite in Canada, I think, according to our notes, 1962 was the first leaving from the United States. In 2013, we had another launch leaving from India, I understand. Mr. Mathieu, I would really like you to take this time to formalize why is it so important that Canada creates its own Canada's launching capabilities, and maybe leading to recommendation a little bit as we are studying this. And then I'll go to Mr. Bain. Thank you.
Recent discussions with the United States Space Force in their assured access to space initiatives that we're a part of as well. They've made clear in memorandum as well to their National Space Council that they would like to see Canadian launch capability. Two primary reasons for that. One is that Florida is kind of a sitting duck for a Category 5 or some other player. And loss of that launch capability means for everybody, us included. And the other is launching twice a week, they're about maxed out. The air traffic industry is yelling and screaming. They're trying to expand as much as they can, but things are moving pretty quickly, and they're congested, basically. It's because there is so much backlog of launch that we've been affected by. We've had to wait to launch satellites into orbit by a year or two because of our priority call by a U.S. government. So having our own priority for a launch capability, providing backup to the United States or a replacement if they're taken out, are kind of the three main ones.
And I'm just going to ask you, we talked a lot in the new DPU, the importance of the Arctic, and certainly for us, for me, it's all about our sovereignty. How does that fit, if I could say, within your interpretation of how a launch within Canadian soil could help on the sovereignty piece of our defense strategy?
Do polar sun-synchronous orbits, which are the ones that go over the poles, basically. Sun-sync, it has to, anyway. Polar-type orbits are what we can offer because we hang out over the top of the North Atlantic. We have a launch due south, basically straight down over Africa and into orbit. It's because of that access over the poles, that's what's so popular for many of these satellite developers for just that kind of thing.
And Mr. Bain, I don't want to go back. I think you were very clear about, who you represent and what it is. But I wanted to ask you about the debris. You mentioned a lot of numbers, 130 million debris that are currently floating. How is there a technology or something to look into that dynamic of actually removing those debris? I remember years ago, I had the privilege of visiting Telesat, and we're talking already about the cemetery of where those debris, and like you said, from years ago. How does that, because as we're launching more, or la commercialisation is needed. From a defense perspective, I think we absolutely need to, but there's debris there that are also at risk of impacting some of the, risk.
Yep, you're right. Where do I start? 130 million pieces of debris sounds like a lot, but they're in certain bands. They're not all over the place, but they're in the bands that are, as you would imagine, the most popular. Your honourable member asked me earlier, I didn't answer his question, but there are specific bands in space. There are specific orbits in space that are much more desirable. Polar orbits, sun-synchronous orbits, where RadarSat flies. Medium Earth orbits where the GPS systems fly. The hardest thing that we deal with from the ground, just to give you something else to think about, is a spent rocket. Once it's taken a satellite to geostationary, there's a piece that's left that's about the size of a city bus, and it moves at 16 kilometers a second in a highly elliptical orbit that goes all the way out to geostationary and comes all the way back to low Earth orbit and goes back out again. And it's on the equatorial plane. It goes right past the GPS satellites every day, and there's no way to track it from the ground. So these things are happening without a lot of people being aware. These things are happening, and they must be tracked, which is why North Star created our system.
So, but that's great to track, and I completely agree. But should we look at also removing them? Like, should we look at technology to actually do something else than sending them to a less desirable orbit circle?
In my business, you can break a lot of laws, but you can't break the laws of physics. An item, you can imagine a city bus moving at 16 kilometers a second. I don't know what technology you could use to grab it, reorient it, and bring it down to low, and bring it down out of its orbit. It has a tendency to want to stay there. It will degrade over time, and so what you're really doing is waiting for it to degrade and fall out and come back down to Earth. It'll do it eventually. But there are other objects in space, and there are a lot of technologies, and there are a lot of companies. We work with a company in the United States, and they're international, called Astroscale, and they do active debris removal. But what they call debris, and you guys maybe think of debris as just a piece of junk, but a spent satellite that's still intact, but and can be picked up about this size, could be grabbed and pulled out of space. But now you're launching a satellite with a rocket to grab a satellite and bring it back down out of orbit. And you've got 130 million pieces to take care of. So the technology has a long way to go to be able to do that kind of cleanup. Yeah.
All right. 2.5 minutes plus 30 seconds.
Merci beaucoup. Monsieur Bain.
Thank you very much, Mr. Bain. Let's keep going on space debris. You referred to buses basically moving this quickly. You can identify objects that are much smaller, 1 centimeter, 10 centimeter wide. I would imagine a bus can cause a lot of damage if it has a collision with a satellite. But I'm also wondering what happens with these smaller debris. What does this mean for Canada if Canada cannot identify that small debris? What risk is that? It's an immediate risk. Since since working on a number of commercial missions, a number of them, my experience, is that there are collisions every day, satellites in space. There's no atmosphere, so there are no vibrations. There's nothing that we can touch on in order to change the stability of the satellite. But the satellites, they move in space. Why? Because debris hit the satellites on a daily basis, meaning that satellites start shifting within the constellations, and that is something we need to track. We need to seriously watch. It's an immediate threat. So our system is designed somewhat for that. And this is the question. Do we have the way to navigate around all of this? That's the question as far as I'm concerned. Can we provide enough information ahead of time to navigate securely. Thank you very much. And as a follow-up, is there a risk in the future that there might be an increase in the number of the large-sized debris or even small-sized debris, in the sense that there are collisions? Would one or the other grow more, or is it similar? The most dangerous is the largest debris, of course, clearly. The smallest debris, if it's a micro collision, that you can handle, but a huge size satellite, that size or larger, is catastrophic. There you have it. And quickly, I have a bit of time left. Among those technologies that are being designed for new satellites, I hear Japan has developed something made of wood that could easily degrade. Are there things that we should watch out for in the future? There is a company here in Canada that is developing launchers that use propellant that is actually renewable. They take former plastic. They chemically they devise a system that is renewable when it comes to this propellant. I found that really quite interesting. Thank you.
And Normandine, 2.5 minutes. Ms. Masson.
Mr. Bain, I wanted to ask you, so you talked about the Space Council, you talked about it being run from the PMO. Is that solely because of the priority that you think that you need and that can only come from the PMO? If that's the case, fair enough. But how do we ensure that something like a Space Council that is meant to maybe bring balance, neutrality, nonpartisanship, how do we ensure that in that case?
That's a great question. It's all by representation. You want representation from the government. You want representation from the commercial enterprise. You want representation from non-government organizations. You want everybody to have a certain amount of seat at the table, to have a voice, to be able to express concerns or raise issues, and work it in an open manner. Back to the leadership question. It's by other people's experiences that we know that it has to be run by the top, because efforts to do it in any other way were not successful. And so, as an environmentalist wanting to protect the environment of space and wanting things to move quickly, I don't want to waste any time. So we know that the formula is it must come from the top. It has to be from the PMO.
Okay. Mr. Matthew, same question.
My experiences with the United States National Space Council and its effectivity and the participation of the user advisory groups, I think, is really fundamental to it, which is the commercial companies that participate in it, and really getting the focus committees that are set up and populated and represented by the government, and then those committees populated to really put the emphasis where it needs to be put.
1 minute. The really big question, of course, was back to that nuclear side of things. What is the bigger impact, I guess, that the Canadian government has in terms of our responsibility to future generations and that environmental impact? Is it the push forward to that bigger détente of the bigger the weapon, the more détente, or is it through negotiations on a non-nuclear proliferation?
I think you've touched on a lot of really interesting subjects. Yeah, you've done really well, because your other comments are the same. I drove past the Russian embassy last night on Charlotte Street with my son, and I pointed it out. And my son said, "Why do we still have an embassy here?" I said, "Because it's the only way you keep communicating with people to solve problems. You must keep the lines of communication open." International collaboration is fundamental, and we will return to a normal and stable environment in space if we have faith in humanity to do that, and North Star's tools and other people's activities in this area are fundamental to that. Military activity, the same as civil activity, has a role to play in securing a safe environment.
Ms. Masson, Mr. Ruff, welcome to the committee. 5 minutes.
Thanks, Chair. I got really a set of questions for both witnesses. So first, to maritime launch. It's too bad you didn't exist and were up and running a number of years ago, because it's one of the Canadian competitors for SpaceX. Part of the reason they lost out was because they wanted to launch from Canadian launch station, and they missed that opportunity, and they would have beat out, and maybe we'd have something different than space or Starlink and everything tied to SpaceX and some of the other stuff, if that would have happened. But anyway, specifically for you, I want you to get on the record on that military side of this house is what benefit, to certain, I get there's certain capabilities. You do have a connection with obviously the CAP, D&D. What specific capabilities is Canada dependent upon or will be dependent upon that by having our own domestic launch? Can you just get that clearly, the specific military context?
Probably the key is the Earth observation. I mean, that's what it's all about with most of these satellites going into orbit. It's looking down. It's not about looking up. And the ability of those satellites to monitor activities on the ground, whether it's GHG or movement, as we've seen in Ukraine, and the monitoring that we've been doing there, and our ability to do that ourselves unhindered.
And I'm assuming, too, Ms. Lalonde brought up the Arctic side of the house, and obviously I think that's a huge advantage that can't be underestimated, is that polar sort of launches that we can have. And a similar theme to you, Mr. Bain, with North Star. Can you explain specifically, I understand fully what you're trying to do and the need for it, but to convince Canadians, convince governments to put the necessary resources to all of these different space aspects that we need, but in particular, sort of what the value you bring to the table, or an industry, another company similar to what you're proposing, the impact and benefit to not only military capabilities that, for Canada and our allies, but to industry from the so what of how, if these collisions happen, because ultimately that's the challenge that governments are facing right now with limited money, is to how do we make Canadians understand this is the value added by preventing these collisions, tracking the debris, et cetera?
On the general note, I don't like to refer to it as a space economy or the economy, because it's all the economy. The economy in space is the economy. And Canada must maintain its position and be competitive in that market. That's an argument. It's about people keeping their jobs. It's about education, and it's about a cycle of training people, keeping people, and building a sound economic base here in Canada and maintaining that. I think it's pretty simple to understand for Canadians that we don't do anything. In the 1970s, we put up the GPS satellites. Nobody knew what to do with them. Now you can't do anything without them. And so that's what space is. It's fundamental to your life. There's nothing you can do on a given day between a financial transaction at the bank or getting something delivered to your house to eat that doesn't go through a system that involves a satellite. They're fundamental to the fabric. And very importantly, there's no backward compatibility. We can't go back to the old system of communicating, to the old system of navigating, to dial-up phones. Doesn't work. We're dependent on the space satellite systems. So let's make sure it stays there. And the only way to do that is to be a good environmentalist and protect the environment.
So tied to that is our space companies that are launching now, and this could go to either one of you, but I imagine maybe more with you, Mr. Bain, is Canada demanding for anything that we're launching here domestically, or that is a Canadian nexus, or even other of our partners in the international community demanding that any new launches have end of life cycle planned into it with a mandatory degrade, so that we're not just leaving crap up there, for lack of better words?
Yes, there is that initiative is certainly afoot, but it's not codified in any sort of way. There is new technology developments, mission extension kits for upper stages, for example, to be able to go and deploy and do other things, remove satellites from orbit, or provide a fueling platform to extend the life of satellites so that you don't have to keep launching more, that kind of thing.
The mechanisms that you can pull on are our own domestic policy, but also the ITU, the International Telecommunications Union, in assigning frequency, as though it may seem abstract. In order to get frequency, you should comply with certain performance criteria in terms of deorbiting and removal, and there are very much a lot of good guidelines that are involved in that. And the United Nations Office for Outer Space Affairs, the Director General there is very active on making sure, Arti Holamani, she's very active on making sure that global policy goes towards making sure you don't launch before you have a set policy. So like we have call before you dig, I say think before you launch.
Final 5 minutes. this is the Defense Committee, and we've heard all kinds of testimony that we're kind of a little late and a dollar short to our involvement in space. It seems to me that the vulnerabilities to being dependent upon operatives who are outside of the country is pretty abundant. I'm sure the Ukrainians get a little nervous when they're dependent upon Elon Musk as to whether they get their signals or whether they don't get their signals. Similarly, the geopolitics of the United States makes one a little nervous as to us not having the ability to either launch or to do what you do, Mr. Bain, or various other things. I don't think that message has sunk in with either the political class or Canadians writ large. So what, sketch out for us what military and security vulnerabilities we've left ourselves open to by not being as involved as we should be. So I'll start with you, Mr. Mathieu, and then go to Mr. Bain.
I guess the way I would answer that is it's related to the recognition by the other five countries that are stepping up. They're recognizing that vulnerability that they have right now, whether it's the UK, Australia, New Zealand, and +2 even. These other countries are actively engaging to bring rocket launch capability, even if they're in the wrong place, the wrong side of the pond, as it were. They're trying to get something in place so that they will have that ability to provide that backup capability. It is kind of a scary world down there. I bring my U.S. passport with me so I can speak openly about my feelings about the U.S. and that potential disruption, if you will, because of the politics there and where things stand. It is a scary world we're living in, and we really do need to get people's attention. When I look across the border as a Canadian looking south to the U.S., it's like watching a train wreck going on. And not having access to that launch capability there on a day in and day out basis could be really fundamentally flawed to just the kinds of things that he's talking about, going to an ATM machine or going to buy tickets to a football game or hockey game. So I think it's the cause and effect that I don't think is really well understood.
Games. Mr. Bain?
I'm a Canadians fan. Sorry. I bleed red, white, and blue. Painting a picture for you. In every threat, there is an opportunity. You've identified and acknowledged there's a tremendous threat. I've heard it in previous testimonies. I've listened to the videos in advance. There is a tremendous threat. It's an opportunity. And we must take that as an opportunity. David Henry Thoreau said, the world is our canvas, and so for our imaginations. So we need to get our imaginations in gear and move forward without restricting ourselves on what we think the way we used to do it is the way we need to do it now. Take a page out of Steve Jobs' book. Why are we doing it this way? It's the way we've always done it. We need to stop that. We need to create new ways, new policies, and we need to embrace. And we need to err on the side of leaning in instead of on the side of, well, we need to study that. So if I had $1 for every time somebody told me I needed to slow down and be more patient, I wouldn't have $140 million because I wouldn't raise money anyway. So the answer is Canada must, if it wants to be a leader in space, lean in on its initiative, lean in and listen and act outside of what their typical comfort zone or policy used to say. And that's why I've asked and pushed, and so it's come through our Space Canada Council, Space Canada board. We must have a National Space Council. We must have a policy. We must move quickly. We must be clear in our objectives. And we must leave this planet, because what we do in this life echoes in eternity. We must leave this planet for the future generations so that they can have access